The gavel came down so hard it cracked against the bench, and the courtroom fell into a silence so heavy that even the ceiling fans seemed to slow their spinning. Every eye turned toward the trembling young woman standing alone at the defendant's table, her second-hand coat too thin for the cold air of the room, her hands shaking as she clutched a folder of papers that no one had bothered to read. Judge Harlan Voss leaned forward, his voice dripping with contempt as he looked down at her worn shoes and asked if she even understood what a courtroom was for, or if she had simply wandered in off the street looking for a warm place to sit. Laughter rippled through the gallery, and in that single humiliating moment, nobody in that room, not the judge, not the lawyers, not the spectators, had any idea that the trembling girl standing before them was about to reveal a secret that would bring the entire courtroom to its knees. If you believe in kindness, in second chances, and in stories that remind us why humanity is still worth believing in, hit that like button right now, drop a comment below, share this video with someone who needs it today, and subscribe to Silent Betrayals so you never miss a story like this one. Her name was Adesi Okonkwo, and she was 23 years old, though the exhaustion carved into her face made her look a decade older. She had grown up in a cramped apartment on the edge of town, raised by a grandmother, who cleaned office buildings at night to keep food on the table. Adesi had never known her parents. They had disappeared into the fog of addiction and poverty before she could form a single memory of their faces. What she did know, what she carried in her chest like a small burning coal, was a fierce determination to become someone who mattered, someone who could stand in a room and not be invisible. She had worked 3 jobs while attending community college at night, sleeping 4 hours if she was lucky, surviving on instant noodles, and the stubborn hope that education was the only ladder out of the life she had been born into. But 2 months ago, her grandmother had suffered a stroke, and the medical bills had swallowed every cent Adesi had saved. Desperate, she had taken a temporary position filing paperwork at a small accounting firm downtown, the only job she could find on short notice. She had no idea when she accepted that job that she was walking into a trap that had been set long before she ever arrived. The firm's senior partner, a smooth-talking man named Reginald Ashworth, had been quietly embezzling funds from client accounts for years, funneling money into shell companies with the help of falsified records. When an internal audit finally caught the discrepancies, Ashworth needed a scapegoat, someone powerless enough to take the fall and unlikely to have the resources to fight back. Adesi, the newest hire with no family connections and no money for a real defense, was the perfect target. Within weeks, forged documents bearing her signature had been planted in the firm's files, and she found herself arrested, charged with fraud and embezzlement, facing a judge who had already decided her guilt before she ever opened her mouth. Judge Harlan Voss was known throughout the county for his impatience with what he called wasted time, and to him, a poor young woman with a public defender who barely had time to review her case was nothing more than an inconvenience. Cluttering his docket, he mocked her clothing. He mocked her hesitant voice when she tried to explain that she had never even seen the documents in question until they were shown to her in handcuffs. He rolled his eyes when her exhausted public defender, a kind but overworked man named Marcus Whitfield, asked for a brief continuance to gather additional evidence. The judge denied it flatly, muttering that the court did not exist to accommodate people who couldn't afford better representation. Adesi sat through each cutting remark with her jaw tight and her eyes burning, not with anger, but with the quiet devastation of someone who had spent her entire life being told she didn't belong and was now watching that belief confirmed in the most public way possible. She thought of her grandmother lying in a hospital bed, unaware that the granddaughter she had sacrificed everything for was about to be branded a criminal. She thought of every night she had stayed awake studying by the light of her phone, because she couldn't afford to keep the lamp on. She thought about how close she had come, how unbearably close to finally building something real, only to have it ripped away by men who had never once had to fight for anything in their lives. But Adeze was not the kind of person who broke quietly. Buried in the folder she had carried into court that day, the folder the judge had dismissed with a wave of his hand, was something she had discovered only 3 nights earlier, while desperately searching through old email backups on the firm's shared server, trying to prove her innocence. It was a set of internal messages, time-stamped months before her employment even began, in which Reginald Ashworth discussed the exact shell companies now listed in her supposed fraud case. She had found the digital fingerprints of a crime that had started long before she ever walked through that office door, and she had spent 3 sleepless nights making sure the evidence was authenticated and impossible to dismiss. When the judge, growing impatient, ordered her to either enter a plea or step aside so the court could move forward, Adeze finally found her voice. It was quiet at first, but it grew steadier with every word. She asked the court's permission to submit new evidence that had only just come to light. The judge scoffed, telling her that unless she had a signed confession from the real culprit, nothing she said would matter. Adeze looked him directly in the eye, something not she done once during the entire humiliating proceeding, and said that she did, in fact, have exactly that. What she revealed was not a confession in the traditional sense, but something far more damning, a recorded voicemail, accidentally left on an old company phone line that had been reassigned to her desk, in which Reginald Ashworth could be heard instructing an associate to make sure the new girl's name goes on everything. She won't have the money to fight it anyway. The courtroom that had been laughing minutes before fell utterly silent. Marcus Whitfield, stunned, asked the judge for immediate permission to enter the recording into evidence, and this time even Judge Voss, hardened as he was, could not ignore what he was hearing. The recording played through the courtroom speakers, Ashworth's voice cold and casual as he condemned an innocent young woman to protect his own fortune. Gasps rippled through the gallery. Prosecutors who moments earlier had painted Adeze as a calculated criminal now sat frozen, realizing they had been used as instruments in someone else's cruelty. And Judge Harlan Voss, the man who had humiliated her without a second thought, sat motionless at his bench, the color draining from his face as the weight of his own arrogance came crashing down around him. In the days that followed, Reginald Ashworth was arrested. The charges against Adeze were dropped entirely, and the story of the poor young woman who had been mocked in open court only to expose a wealthy man's corruption spread through the local news like wildfire. Judge Voss issued a rare public apology, admitting that he had let appearances cloud his judgment in a way that nearly destroyed an innocent life. Adeze did not gloat, did not seek revenge. She simply asked that her grandmother's medical bills be forgiven as part of the settlement, and returned quietly to her studies, more determined than ever to become the kind of lawyer who would never let another Adeze be humiliated for simply being poor. If this story touched your heart even a little, if it made you believe again in justice, in resilience, and in the quiet strength of people the world too often overlooks, please take a moment to like this video and share it with someone who needs a little hope today. And before we go, if you made it all the way to this line, drop the word "seen" in the comments below, because Adeze spent so much of her life feeling invisible, and I want her story, and every person like her, to know that they are finally truly seen. Adeze went on to graduate at the top of her class 2 years later, and the first case she ever argued as a licensed attorney was for a teenage boy who, like her, had no money and no voice. Only this time, she made certain the courtroom listened.